Okay, so where were we? Jane has written a letter to Caroline to find out whether Bingley will ever return to Netherfield. Wickham has revealed Mr. Darcy's wicked and underhanded betrayal, and Charlotte Lucas accepted the proposal of the ridiculous Mr. Collins. Things are heating up. Let's dive back in. Jane finally receives a reply from Caroline, confirming that they'll be remaining in London for the winter and how delighted they are with Darcy's sister, Georgiana. Caroline makes a point of saying how Georgiana and Bingley are getting along like a house on fire. Jane tries to put on a brave face and put Bingley behind her. It's such a disappointment, but Jane refuses to believe that Bingley's sisters have anything to do with it. He's simply lost interest. Hey team, just a reminder, if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps the channel out, and our next upload could be on something taught in your next class. Thanks, and back to the video. But Elizabeth seethes with contempt. How could Bingley allow his sisters to manipulate him like this? His weakness and his sister's scheming only confirm her disgust in people's behaviour in general, citing Charlotte's marriage to Mr. Collins as just another example. Why isn't everyone as sensible as her? Sweet Jane tells Elizabeth she's judging them too harshly. Meanwhile, Wickham's visits to the Bennets help dispel the current gloom in the house. Mr. Bennet even suggests he could be a good match for Elizabeth, joking that, like her sister, she too could be jilted by a fine young man. Gee, thanks, Dad. With wedding plans arranged, Mr. Collins leaves his soon-to-be bride again, and Mr. Bennet's brother and sister-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, arrive at Longbourn for Christmas. Mr. Gardiner is kind and polite, working as a tradesman in London, and Mrs. Gardiner is a warm and intelligent woman, a favourite of Jane and Elizabeth's. Mrs. Bennet complains of Jane and Elizabeth both missing out on marriages, especially Elizabeth's refusal of Mr. Collins, and his and Charlotte's eventual inheritance of Longbourn. Once alone, Mrs. Gardiner speaks sympathetically to Elizabeth about Jane's disappointment. The affections of men like Bingley can be fleeting. But Elizabeth insists that his departure was a deliberate manipulation by his sisters. To cheer Jane up, Mrs. Gardiner suggests she come to stay with them in London, but goes on to assure Elizabeth that Jane and Bingley are unlikely to meet there, living in vastly different parts of town. While Elizabeth assures Mrs. Gardiner that Jane won't make contact, she secretly hopes that Bingley's affections could return should they happen to meet again. Having noticed the connection between Wickham and Elizabeth, Mrs. Gardiner waits for a moment alone to gently caution Elizabeth. She mustn't let her feelings cloud her judgment. It would be unwise to marry a man with no money. Respecting her aunt's advice, Elizabeth admits her feelings for him but promises she won't rush into anything. The Gardiners and Jane leave for London, and Charlotte pays Elizabeth a farewell visit before leaving with Mr. Collins to be married. Mrs. Bennet insincerely wishes Charlotte well, and Charlotte asks Elizabeth to stay in touch and visit often. While this doesn't appeal to Elizabeth, she can't refuse her friend. Once they're gone, Charlotte often writes to Elizabeth about her happy new circumstances with Mr. Collins, which Elizabeth finds hard to believe. Jane also writes to Elizabeth from London, where she's staying with the Gardiners. She tells Lizzie that, despite writing to Caroline Bingley, she's received no reply. Maybe her letter got lost in the mail? Jane soon visits Caroline, but their interaction is brief and tense. Still, Jane holds out hope that Caroline will return her visit and maintain their friendship. 4 weeks pass, and Jane hears nothing. When Caroline finally pays a visit, her cold manner confirms the worst. Her friendship with Jane was false all along. It's also clear that neither Caroline nor Bingley intend to return to Netherfield. Elizabeth is proven right, but takes no pleasure in her sister's pain, and soon she too finds herself slighted. Wickham's affections suddenly shift from Elizabeth to Miss King, a young lady who has recently inherited £10,000. Logical as she is, Elizabeth isn't affected much by this and wishes him well. She writes to her aunt that she's realised it wasn't real love in the first place. Lydia and Kitty, however, don't take the news nearly as well. January and February pass uneventfully at Longbourn, and Elizabeth is keen to get some time away from home. So she goes to visit Charlotte at Hunsford Parsonage. Sir William Lucas takes Elizabeth, along with his second daughter, Maria. They stop along the way in London to see Jane. To Elizabeth's relief, she seems as well as ever. Mrs. Gardiner speaks privately with Elizabeth, relaying that while Jane has gone through periods of sadness, she has given up Caroline's friendship for good. Mrs. Gardiner also consoles Elizabeth about losing Wickham. She suggests the timing of his sudden attention towards Miss King, so soon after her inheritance, is dodgy. Elizabeth defends him. Hadn't Mrs. Gardiner advised her not to seek out a marriage unless it came with financial security? Why shouldn't he do the same? Still, his lack of tact is a bit irksome, don't you think? Then, to Elizabeth's delight, Mrs. Gardiner invites her on a summer tour of the Lake Country, which she gleefully accepts. How nice it will be to immerse herself in nature, away from the drama of men and romance. Elizabeth leaves London in high spirits, and within a few hours, the three of them arrive at Hunsford Parsonage, where Elizabeth and Charlotte joyfully reunite. Mr. Collins gives them a grand tour of their home, going to great lengths to point out its finery, right down to every piece of furniture. Elizabeth smirks to herself. Maybe he's trying to show her what she missed out on. Charlotte manages to mostly ignore her new husband's embarrassing ways, and Elizabeth is surprised to see that she's built a happy life here. The next day, Maria calls Elizabeth downstairs in quite a tizzy. A carriage containing Mr. Berg and a companion arrive, paying a visit to Charlotte and Mr. Collins. A great honour indeed. Elizabeth smirks that the fragile and sickly Mr. Berg will make the perfect wife for Mr. Darcy, since that's who she's apparently intended for. Lizzie then learns that they're all invited to dine at Rosings, the de Bourghs' grand house, the next day. Whoopee. Mr. Collins is ecstatic that his guests will get to see the splendour of Lady Catherine and, most importantly, witness her good regard for him. The next day, he pulls Elizabeth aside and tells her not to worry too much about her simple clothes in front of Lady Catherine. In fact, Lady Catherine prefers to keep everyone's rank well defined. Wow! Thanks. Amongst the wealth and splendour of Rosings, they meet the pompous and condescending Lady Catherine. Her haughtiness reminds Elizabeth very much of Darcy, and Mr. Berg, unlike her mother, doesn't utter a peep. Dinner consists of Mr. Collins and Sir William Lucas heaping praise on Lady Catherine, which suits her just fine. But Elizabeth is unnerved by their fawning and the awkwardness of the whole evening. After dinner, and before the men join them for cards, Lady Catherine lectures Charlotte on how to run a household. She then grills Elizabeth with a series of invasive questions about her and her family. She openly disapproves of Elizabeth's lack of musical talent, education, and being raised with no governess. When Elizabeth answers her directly and without fear, Lady Catherine is quite taken aback by her boldness. How dare she not shrink before Lady Catherine's superior rank? Later, while travelling back to the Collins home in Lady Catherine's carriage, Elizabeth gives Charlotte a lukewarm assessment of the evening. But, as always, Mr. Collins jumps in with endless praise for his wonderful patroness. Can Elizabeth continue to put on a happy face for Charlotte's new circumstances? And dare we hope that Jane will hear from Bingley? Tune in next time to find out. We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.